billionaire offered $1 million to anyone who could start her dead father's boat. And one after another, every expert in the country tried and failed. Marine restorers flew up from Michigan. A vintage engine man came all the way from a shop in Connecticut that does cars for the people who own islands. An actual mechanical engineer came, slide rule in his head and 40 letters after his name. They set up in a boathouse the size of a small church, with their laptops and their pressure gauges and their imported tools, and every single one of them packed it all back up and drove off shaking his head. And the boat just sat there on her cradle, in the middle of all that glass and water light, quiet as a coffin, for the better part of 3 weeks. Then a worn-out boat mechanic from a town most people couldn't find on a map, in a clean shirt that still had grease worked permanent into the cuffs, walked in and told that woman he didn't want her $1 million. He wanted a beat-up brass primer screw worth about $5 at a hardware store. The room laughed at me. Eleanor didn't, because something in my face must have told her I wasn't making a joke, and something in my face must have told her I'd known her father. And inside of 10 minutes, that silent old launch was going to fill that boathouse wall to wall with a sound that man had been gone too long and too cold in the ground to make himself. Not because I'm smarter than those fellows. I want that clear right from the start. I'm not. Every one of them walked in and saw an engine. I walked in and remembered a man. If you've ever lost somebody, and you'd hand over everything in your truck just to hear one small ordinary sound of them one more time, a screen door, a kettle, a certain laugh from the next room, then stick with me a while. This story's for you more than it's for anybody. My name's Sam Doyle. I'm 46 years old, and I fix boats in Gravenhurst, up in the Muskoka lakes, same as my dad did and his dad before him. Doyle Marine. My grandfather started it in a leaky shed off the bay with 2 wrenches and a stubborn streak, and there's a sign my dad hand-painted hanging over the door that I've never had the heart to replace even though the lettering's gone soft and gray. I grew up in that shop. Learned the trade standing on an overturned milk crate so I could see over the engine, my dad's hand around mine on the wrench. Both of us smelling like two-stroke and the burnt coffee that lived in the percolator on the parts bench. Somewhere along the line, it stopped being a job we did and turned into the thing we were. You don't decide that. It just happens to you, one season at a time, until you look up and you're 46, and your hands know an engine better than they know how to do almost anything else. It's been me and my girl for a while now, Josie. She's 9. Her mom and I came apart slow and quiet a few years back. No big drama, just 2 people who'd run out of road, and these days it's the 2 of us in the little house up the concession with the wood stove and the bad furnace and the dog. Weekends are mine. That part matters later, so hang on to it. For going on 22 years, I was Wallace Brandt's boatman. Now, Wallace Brandt was a self-made fellow, and a big one. He'd built a forestry company up out of absolutely nothing, started with 1 truck and a chainsaw and a handshake, and ended up with his name on mills from here to Thunder Bay and a fortune nobody could have counted with a calculator. The kind of story they put in the business pages and the after-dinner speeches. But I want to be honest with you, because if I let you think that's how I knew him, then nothing else in this is going to land right. That's not how I knew him at all. I knew him as a man who loved boats, the way certain people love a song they heard when they were young and poor and full of wanting. Not as a hobby, not as a thing he collected to impress the other men with money. Helplessly, in his whole body, he had the means to keep a fleet and a staff of white-gloved fellows from the fancy yards down on the lake to wipe the dew off the bow rails every morning. And instead, for 20-some years, that man drove himself up the highway and turned down a gravel road to a cracked little lot, to have a guy named Sam in a faded shirt look after the one boat he loved more than all the rest of it put together. Somebody asked him once, right in front of me, why on earth he bothered, and I never forgot what he said. He said, "Because Sam doesn't fix my boat. He listens to her. There's a difference between those 2 things, son, and at my age it's about the only difference I've got any use for left." We got to be friends the slow way, the only real way. The better part of 2 decades, 1 season at a time. He'd come by the shop on a Saturday in May when there wasn't a blessed thing wrong with that launch, just to push a double-double from the Timmies in town into my hand and lean his weight against a sawhorse and talk to me about nothing in the world. I came to know his hands, big square working hands he'd never quite lost even after 30 years in good suits. I knew he favored his left hip when the weather was about to turn, knew it before the forecast did. I knew that when he was truly happy and didn't know anybody was watching, he'd whistle, low and tuneless, some old thing from when he was a kid with holes in his boots. And I knew that boat. I knew her better than I've ever known almost anything in this life. She was a long mahogany launch, a ditch burn out of the 30s, the kind of boat that's worth more now than my house and the lot it sits on and the truck in the driveway combined. He'd wanted one since he was a barefoot boy watching the rich families idle past the public dock, close enough to envy and too far to ever touch, and the day he finally felt he'd earned the right to own one, he bought her and never looked back. He named her the Lorraine, after his wife, who'd passed years before I ever met him. He'd run his thumb along the brass of her dash sometimes while he talked slow without knowing he was doing it, the way you'd touch a sleeping person's hair. I'll tell you one small thing about Wallace because it says the whole man. The first season I had the Lorraine, I stayed 2 hours past close on a Friday, chasing a vibration nobody else could feel, a thrust bearing a hair out of true, the kind of thing 99 owners out of 100 would have gone their whole lives never noticing. He noticed. And when I tracked it down, I didn't put those 2 hours on his bill because the truth was I'd enjoyed the hunt. He found out. He always found out, and the next Saturday he turned up with 2 coffees and parked himself on my bench and told me, dead serious, that a man who'd undercharge him for work he'd loved doing was a man he could trust with anything for the rest of his natural life. He was right about that. In 20-some years, he never once asked what a job would run before I did it. Not one time. He trusted I'd be fair, and I trusted he'd never make me prove it. And somewhere in that little arrangement, we quietly became the kind of friends who never once had to say so out loud. I buried my own dad last fall. I need to put that here, because without it, none of the rest of this is honest. His heart, in the end. He'd been slowing for a few years, and we both knew it, and neither of us said it, the way men in my family handle a thing by not handling it. I'll come back around to him, because he ended up mattering more in that glass boathouse than I ever could have guessed, standing at his grave side in the cold with the first snow already spitting down. But I need you to hold him in the back of your mind, the same way I was holding him in mine all that winter. Because everything I understood that day, I understood it on account of there being a fresh stone up at the cemetery with my own father's name cut into it. Here's the thing, nobody warns you about losing somebody. It isn't the big absences that finally put you on your knees. It isn't the empty chair at Christmas. You see that one coming a mile off. You brace for it. You get through it. It's the small sounds, the ambush of realizing 3 weeks after the funeral, standing in a grocery aisle for no reason, that you are never again, not as long as you live, going to hear that person clear their throat in the next room. My dad ran a wood stove his whole life, even after he could have afforded better, because he didn't trust a furnace to do an honest job. Every single morning of my childhood, sometime around 5, I'd half wake to the sound of him down in the cold kitchen shaking down the grate. This particular iron rattle and scrape, then the clank of the firebox door, then the tick of the kettle going on. It was the sound that meant the day was safe to come. The house was warm. He was up. The world was being handled by a man who knew how. After we buried him, I went out to his place to start in on his things, the way you have to eventually, and I stood in that cold kitchen at first light and I caught myself listening. For the grate, for the door, for the kettle, for him, and the house just sat there, quiet, the cold creeping back into it because there was nobody left to drive it out, and I'd have given the shop, the truck, every dollar I'll ever earn for 30 more seconds of that iron rattle from a man who was never going to make any sound again. That's what grief is. Once the casseroles are gone, and the cards quit coming. It moves down into the small sounds and it lives there. I learned it the hard way in my dad's empty kitchen, and I didn't know it yet, but it was getting me ready. That's the cruel mercy of the thing. It wrecks you, and then it makes you useful to the next person it's going to wreck. Which brings me, finally, to the Lorraine, and to a silence I'd never heard the likes of. Wallace died over the winter, went in his sleep, peaceful, the way only the genuinely lucky ones get to go. I read it in the paper before anybody thought to call me. I put on the same suit I'd worn to my own dad's funeral, and I stood at the very back of an enormous room full of mayors and money. The boatman, nobody there could have named, and I grieved my friend in private and went home and didn't talk about it. He had one child, Eleanor, his only kid, and the sole heir to the whole towering pile of it. A billionaire in her own name now, on paper, which I'd come to understand soon enough she'd have signed away to the last loony for 5 more minutes with the old man. When the estate finally sorted itself out, Eleanor kept the boat. Of course she did. The Lorraine was the most him of anything he'd ever owned. More him than the houses, more him than the company, more him than any of it. And then, come ice out in the spring, when the lake finally opened up black and cold and the docks went back in, Eleanor went out to the boathouse to start her father's launch. To hear her, I'm sure, far more than to take her anywhere. And the boat was dead. Not the battery. That was the first thing anybody checked, and it was fine, fully charged. The fuel was fresh and clean. The compression was good across every cylinder. Spark, fuel, air, every last system in that engine was, by every measure a man can take, in perfect working order. And still she would not catch. She'd turn over and over and over and never fire. Like she'd made up her own mind the day her owner's heart stopped to go quiet right along with him. And Eleanor, drowning, rich past the point of any sense, and unable to stand the idea that her father's most beloved thing on this earth had gone silent, did the thing people with limitless money do when they finally hit something money was built to fix. She threw a mountain of it at the problem. She put out word, publicly, that she'd pay $1 million cash to anyone alive who could start her late father's boat. And, Lord, did they come. For a number like that, the best in the business came running. Restorers, who do the boats that win the big shows. Engine men who can date a casting by the smell of it. The fellow from Connecticut, the engineer. They filled that boathouse with gleaming equipment and ran their diagnostics, and one by one, every single one of them slowly came up against the same maddening wall, the test results all telling them the very same impossible thing, over and over. There is nothing wrong with this boat. Nothing, and yet she would not run. I only heard about any of it because the estate's lawyer happened to remember there'd been a particular boatman old Wallace had trusted for decades. He called me near the end of it, after 3 weeks of the world's finest had thrown up their hands, and I could hear the apology in his voice, ringing up a small-town grease monkey as a last resort. "Mr. he said, "I'll be honest, this is a long shot, and you'd of course be just as eligible for the reward as anyone, but Eleanor's at the end of her rope, and you did know the boat." I damn near said no. I want you to know that. I was still down at the bottom of my own well, my dad only months gone, with no stomach at all for a circus. But I'd loved Wallace Brant for 22 years, so in the end I drove out one last time, the same drive I'd made 1,000 times, to put my hands on his boat once more. The boathouse was a cathedral. Glass on 3 sides, the lake throwing light up under the rafters, cedar that smelled like money. And in the middle of all of it, up on her cradle, sat the Lorraine, gleaming, perfect, silent, ringed by the wreckage of everybody else's failure, abandoned laptops gone dark, a pressure gauge somebody'd left hanging off the carb, 2 technicians still hunched and muttering over readings that wouldn't behave, 50. And off to one side stood Eleanor herself, dressed like the photographs, composed right down to the surface and absolutely hollowed out underneath it, wearing that bone-deep tiredness that only belongs to a person who's been made to grieve for weeks with an audience standing around watching. The experts turned and looked at me when I came through the door, the old guy, the faded shirt, the boots that had clearly seen a real day's work, with that polite, knowing little contempt that credentialed men keep ready for a fellow who works with his hands and hasn't got a thing after his name. One of them, I saw it plain, smiled to himself and looked away. And I didn't look at the boat. I need you to really catch that, because it turned out to be the whole thing. Every one of those brilliant, expensive men had walked into that boathouse and looked first, and only, at the engine. I didn't. I crossed the floor to Eleanor and I said, "I'm awful sorry about your dad. He was my friend for 22 years. And he talked about you all the time. I just thought you ought to know that." And that careful, composed woman's face came apart down the middle, just for a second, just for a flash, before she could catch it. Because I don't think, in 3 solid weeks of million-dollar problem-solving, one single one of those men had said one word to her about Wallace as a person, a father. They'd all come for the puzzle. Not one of them had come for her. Then I asked her the question that started everything. "Eleanor," I said, "when they gave you your dad's effects, the things that were in his pockets on his keyring the day he passed, was there a brass primer screw?" "Old one. worn down smooth, knurling almost rubbed off it, maybe an inch and a half long, with a little wing on the head. He carried it loose with his keys for 30 years. It looked like a bit of hardware, like absolute junk sitting next to everything else he owned. She stared at me a long moment, and then, slow, she nodded. The estate had catalogued it. It was his box, some wallet, and his watch, and his reading glasses, and not one single person had thought a thing of it. Just an old worn bit of brass with the keys, the kind of thing you'd sweep off a workbench, worth maybe $5. That, I said, is what I'd like, not the million. I don't want your money, I want that primer, please. Go and get it. And the experts laughed. Right out loud, every one of them. The old fool wants a chewed-up bolt instead of $1 million. Can you believe this guy? Can you believe what walks in off the road? But Eleanor wasn't laughing. Eleanor was looking very hard at my face, and she turned and sent somebody running for the box of her father's things. Now, let me tell you what I knew standing in that boathouse that not one of those gifted men did. Because it had nothing to do with engineering and everything in the world to do with having known a man, and it turned out with having known my own father. That launch had a vintage gas engine in her, and a cold one of those won't fire without being primed. A shot of raw fuel worked straight into the cylinders by hand before she'll catch. There's a little port in the manifold for it, and a primer screw that threads into the port to do the work. Simple as anything. And every one of those experts had primed her, of course they had, with the pretty brass primer that came in the boat's documentation kit, the showpiece, the obvious tool any organized professional on Earth would reach for first, sitting right there in the velvet-lined case with all the certificates. 50. About 30-some years back, before Wallace ever owned her, that engine had a hard rebuild, and the man who did it was my own father. I was a teenager handing him wrenches, and during that rebuild, the original primer port had got buggered, threads stripped clean out, and my dad retapped it to a thread of his own, an odd one, nothing standard because that's what he had in the box that afternoon, and it held, and he was never one to do a job twice. Then he cut a primer to match it by hand and hung it on the engine. Only that one primer, on that one odd thread, will ever seat into that port and seal tight enough to push fuel where it needs to go. The shiny showpiece in the velvet case looks like it fits. It threads in 2 turns and stops, and it'll never seal, never prime a thing, not in 100 years. When Wallace bought the boat, that hand-cut primer came with her, and I told him the story of it, and the old man, who loved a thing more for its scars than its shine, pulled it off the engine and put it on his own keyring and carried it in his pocket every day for 30 years, so that wherever the Lorraine was, the one key to her heart was on him. The experts saw it in the box of his effects and dismissed it on sight as worthless junk, because it looked exactly like worthless junk. And I knew, the second I walked through that door, that it was the only object in that whole glass cathedral that meant a single thing. They brought me the box. I opened it, and there it was, the brass gone soft and dark, the little wing worn down where his thumb had ridden it 10,000 times. I held it a second longer than I needed to, because I'd watched my own father cut that exact piece with his exact hands when I was a kid, and I'd watched Wallace's thumb worry it smooth for 20 years after, and holding it now was its own kind of grief and its own kind of grace, braided up together so tight I couldn't have told you where one ended. It was, for me, like hearing the iron grate at 5 in the morning. It was both of them at once. Then I threaded my dad's old primer into the port, and I worked a little fuel into her by hand the way Wallace did it every single time, and I lowered myself down into that man's own seat, and I turned her over. She caught on the first pull. That deep old straight 6 came roaring up out of 3 weeks of dead silence, and filled that boathouse floor to rafters with the living sound of a man who, it turned out, was not all the way gone after all. Not while his boat could still be made to sing his song. 3 weeks of the finest engine men $1 million could pull out of the woodwork, beaten clean by a $5 bit of brass, any one of them would have dropped in the scrap pail without a second look. And Eleanor made a sound I'll carry to my own grave. She got both hands up over her mouth and her knees just went, right out from under her, and she sat straight down on the cold cedar floor in her good clothes, and she wept. Not the careful, contained grieving she'd been performing for an audience for weeks. The real thing, the deep thing, the thing that comes up from the very bottom. Because she was hearing her father again. the engine he'd loved with his whole heart running exactly the way it ran when he was alive and well, and whistling under his breath at the helm. I'd handed her back the iron grate at 5 in the morning. I'd given a grieving daughter one more ordinary, holy sound of the man she'd lost. I shut her down again after a minute, gentle, because you don't run a cold old engine hard like that for long, and any boatman worth his salt knows it, and Wallace would have cuffed me round the ear for it. And the quiet that came down after wasn't the dead quiet that had been in that room before. It was a different thing entirely. It was a silence with the sound still living inside it. Even the experts felt it. The engineer took his cap off without seeming to know he'd done it. Nobody said a word for a long while, because you don't, in a silence like that. You just let it be what it is. And Eleanor, still down on the floor, looked up at me and asked me why. Why in the world I hadn't taken the $1,000,000. Anybody else alive would have. The experts would have taken it and argued for more. Why on God's green earth a worn-out bit of brass instead? So I lowered myself down and sat on that cold floor next to a weeping billionaire, which underneath it all was just two people who'd lost their fathers sitting together on the ground. And I told her the truth. I told her about my own dad, months in the cemetery up the road. I told her about the iron grate and the kettle and how I'd give every last thing I own just to hear that sound one more cold morning. And I told her that taking $1,000,000 to start her father's boat would have felt to me, down in my gut, exactly like charging a grieving daughter money to hear her own dad's voice, like standing at a graveside with my hand out. I didn't do it for money, I told her. I did it because somebody I'd loved for 22 years was living in the sound of that engine, same as somebody she'd loved her whole life was living in it. 50, and you don't put a price on the act of handing a person their father back for 30 seconds. I just wanted the primer, I told her, because my own dad cut it with his own hands a lifetime ago, and Wallace carried it in his pocket for 30 years, and there is no amount of money on this earth that's worth more to me than one worn ordinary thing that two men I loved both held. That was payment enough. That was a fortune. Now, Eleanor wouldn't let me walk out of there with only a primer. But, and this is the part that stayed with me, she didn't insult the whole moment by trying to force that $1,000,000 into my hands either, because in 1 hour on a cold floor she'd come to understand me well enough to know the money would have cheapened the only real thing that had passed between us. So instead she asked me about my shop, about my grandfather and my dad and now me, and then she asked about my girl. I hadn't even told her about Josie, but Josie was out in the truck that very day, working through a puzzle book in the back seat, because it was a Saturday, and a Saturday is mine. And when Eleanor learned I had a 9-year-old and that the 3-generation shop my grandfather started with 2 wrenches was scraping by the slow, hard way every small, honest shop in this country scrapes by now, she did the quiet, dignified, exactly right thing I've come to believe only the truly changed are even able to do. She didn't write me a check. She knew better than that by then. Instead, she made my shop her patron, in the old true sense of the word. She sends her whole family's boats to me now for their keeping. And she told every cottage country friend she has, and at that level of money, that's a long list, about the only man her father ever trusted with the thing he loved most. Inside of a single season, that struggling little shop with the cracked lot had a waiting list out the door clear into next summer, and my Josie has an education fund with her name on it that'll see her clear through any school she's a mind to go to. Eleanor handed my whole family a future, and she did it in a way I could take with my spine still straight, as one grieving person to another, dignity left whole on both sides. And here's the part that matters to me the most, when I lie awake turning that strange day over. Josie gets to keep the family shop, the one her great-grandfather started, the one I'll hand down to her one day if she ever wants it, and lately I think she might. The chain didn't break, same as Wallace's chain doesn't break every time Eleanor goes out to the boathouse now, which she does, she told me, once a week, just to start the Lorraine and sit there with her eyes closed and listen. She hardly ever takes her anywhere. She just starts her up, and she listens to her father a while, and then she shuts her down and goes back up to the house. I keep my dad's old primer on my own keyring now, right next to the truck key, brass gone soft, the wing worn smooth, and every time my thumb finds it without my meaning it to, I think of a man who drove all the way up the highway for 22 years, because I listened to his boat instead of just fixing her. And I think of my own dad in the cold ground, and the iron grate I'll never hear again. And I think that maybe the whole point of a life spent with your two hands on things is finally learning that the cheapest, most worn out, most completely overlooked object in the whole room is more often than not the only one in it that was ever holding any love at all. That night I tucked Josie into bed and she asked me, half asleep, if I'd really fixed the rich lady's fancy boat. She'd seen the big glass boathouse through the truck window and it had stuck with her. And I told her I had. Yes, she asked if it had been hard. And I said, no, baby. It was about the easiest thing in the whole world. I just remembered somebody. She didn't know what I meant by that, and that's all right. She will, someday, a long way off if there's any mercy in it. She'll lose somebody she loves, and she'll find herself standing somewhere quiet and aching with her whole body just to hear one small vanished sound one more time, and on that day she'll understand every word her old man ever meant by it. I pray it's a long way off. But she'll have the shop, and she'll have the primer someday, and she'll understand. And 50. So let me ask you the one thing I really want to know tonight. A whole boathouse full of certified geniuses walked in and saw an engine, and one tired boatman walked in and remembered a man. And that right there is the whole difference between a $1 million failure and a $5 miracle. So tell me, what's the small, ordinary sound, the grate of a stove or a screen door spring or a name called twice from another room, that you'd give just about anything to hear one more time from someone you've lost? Tell me about it down below. Say their name if you want to. I read everyone, and the next cold morning the kettle ticks on in my own kitchen. I'll be thinking of yours right alongside mine. I've turned that day over 100 times since, and what gets me every time isn't the boat or the money or the look on those experts' faces. It's how small the real thing was, a bit of brass worn soft in a dead man's pocket. The whole miracle came down to me being the only one in that boathouse who'd bothered, over 22 years, to learn who Wallace Brandt actually was instead of just billing him for the work. Nothing happens for no reason. The Lorraine wouldn't run for those men because they walked in chasing a problem, and she ran for me because I walked in carrying a friendship. That's not luck. That's just what you get back from the kind of attention most people are too busy to pay. I think about my dad cutting that primer 30 years ago in a cold shop, never knowing he'd one day hand a grieving woman her father back. He didn't do careful work because somebody was watching. He did it because doing a thing right was simply who he was, and that quiet decency outlived him. It outlived Wallace, too. If there's one thing I'd want Josie to take from all this, it's that the way you treat people when there's nothing in it for you is the only reputation that ever really pays. Eleanor didn't make my shop her patron because I was clever. She did it because I sat on a cold floor and chose not to put a price on her father's voice. But decency on its own wasn't enough, and I won't pretend it was. I knew which primer mattered because I'd spent a lifetime with my hands on engines and my ears open, learning the kind of thing no diagnostic machine will ever tell you. Those men had more schooling than I'll ever have. What they didn't have was the patience to notice the small, unglamorous truth sitting right in front of them. Real understanding usually looks like that. Plain, easy to overlook, earned slow. And none of it would have held together without plain stubbornness. 3 generations of Doyles kept that little shop alive through bad winters and lean years when walking away would have been the sensible thing. My grandfather, my dad, me. We just didn't quit. That refusal to break is the only reason there was still a shop for Eleanor to save, still a trade for me to hand my girl someday. So that's what I'd tell you if you were sitting across from me. Be the kind of person who does right when no one's keeping score. Pay attention long enough to actually understand things and people, not just label them. And when it gets hard, and it will, dig in and don't let go. A worn-out boatman with grease in his cuffs got to hand a billionaire her father back for 30 seconds, and it wasn't magic. It was just those 3 things, practiced quietly for a long, long time.